It's morning, 20 miles from the enemy. These are American boys going to work.
I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. Nelson Mandela. The Tuskegee Airmen had many hills to climb on their path to success. In the midst of the chaos of World War II, they fought a separate understated battle in the skies. In addition to battling the Luftwaffe, the airmen were charged with fighting the racist notions of American society. With each mission, the airmen fought back against discrimination in the military dating all the way back to the Revolutionary War. African Americans had fought for the United States on the ground and on the seas, but the sky was uncharted territory. The Tuskegee Airmen overcame the tragedies of racism and prejudice from the War Department, their commanders, and their fellow servicemen to become triumphant as pioneers of black military aviation, emerging as a prominent factor in the integration of the armed forces and eventually becoming a catalyst in the civil rights movement. Enthusiasm for aviation grew in the United States between the two world wars. With the emergence of military aviation during World War I and the esteemed white aviators Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart growing in popularity, many citizens, including African Americans, dreamed of taking to the skies. Unfortunately for young African Americans, their hopes of flying for the military were dashed by the racist beliefs of mid-20th century America. African Americans were told that they did not possess the sufficient intelligence required to pilot sophisticated military aircraft. However, despite these barriers, black civilian aviators such as Charles A. Anderson, Bessie Coleman, and Hubert Julian began to fly. In previous wars, black soldiers were restricted to support roles in menial duties far from the battlefield. Nonetheless, the American government, pressured by potential future conflicts, began to evaluate the role of African American soldiers in future wars. This manifested itself into a series of racist government studies about black soldiers, including a 1925 War College paper which described the purported deficiencies of the black man. His mental inferiority and the inherent weaknesses of his character are factors that must be considered with great care in the preparation of any plan for his employment in war. However, the conflicts they dreaded were already becoming a reality. Thousands of miles away in Europe, nationalism and fascism were on the rise. In Germany, Adolf Hitler spewed Nazi rhetoric, eventually launching the world into another major war. World War II began on September 1, 1939, over a decade after the War College's racist study about the future usage of African American soldiers. The United States joined the war against Germany and the Axis powers on December 8, 1941, after an attack on Pearl Harbor, sparking almost 4 years of conflict in Europe. The war would involve aerial combat at an unprecedented level, causing the demand for trained military pilots to substantially increase during the 1940s and opening the door for black military pilots. The tragedy of the Tuskegee Airmen stems from a cohesive effort by the U.S. military and government to keep African Americans from joining the Army Air Corps, as well as the continued personal and systematic racism towards the airmen, even after the conclusion of the war. In January of 1941, the War Department began the Tuskegee experiment, which called for the activation of the first ever Negro Pursuit Squadron. The next year, the Tuskegee Institute, a black college in Alabama, received $1.6 million to build a military airfield, where white officers were to command the African American pilots. White officers enforced segregation by posting whites and colored signs all over the new airfield. This discrimination was also prevalent among white locals who did not want African American pilots in their community. Sadly, being able to endure such personal attacks was a prerequisite for any cadet. Once deployed to Europe, the airmen continued to face racism, however now from their commanders. In September of 1943, the airmen were commanded by Colonel William W. Momeyer, who penned the Momeyer Report, a report that, like many before it, questioned the bravery of African American pilots. Additionally, the War Department wanted the Tuskegee Airmen to fail, even though their success would benefit the war effort.
This thing at Tuskegee is an experiment to prove that you cannot be decent pilots. That was the Army's attitude. We're going to prove to you that because this report is telling us what you guys are like, we're going to prove to you you cannot be pilots. So They had small classes, and the notion was you guys are going to fail and we'll just sweep you off and forget about it.
For example, Henry Stimson, the United States Secretary of War, had strong opinions on the Tuskegee Airmen's viability in combat. Stimson expected the Tuskegee Airmen to make little or no contribution to victory over the Axis powers. He looked upon the program as a concession to a politically active minority rather than a useful element in the nation's war effort. It is tragic that the people who were supposed to support the program and the airmen ultimately only saw it as an experiment. The airmen gained their first combat experience when they were deployed to Morocco in April of 1943. Once in battle, the Tuskegee Airmen's triumphs came from an almost never-ending stream of firsts. Most significantly, the airmen of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, commanded by Benjamin O. Davis Jr., became the first African-American fighter pilot group to ever see combat on June 2, 1943. During that first battle, Lieutenant Charles B. Hall would become the first African-American to ever shoot down an enemy plane. This success also translated at a larger level to the Tuskegee Airmen's escort duty. The Tuskegee Airmen protected bombardiers during several escort missions and lost fewer bombers than any other fighter group during the war. The 332nd were in high demand by U.S. bomber units because of their outstanding protection. German fighters would become demoralized upon discovering a bomber unit escorted by planes with the characteristic red tails. On July 18, 1944, the 332nd shot down 12 enemy airplanes as part of their escort duties, beating any previous record set by white pilots. The Tuskegee Airmen were successful in both shooting down enemy aircraft and protecting bombardiers, proving that African-American pilots could handle the pressure of warfare. The airmen had an important impact immediately back home after the war. Their successes resulted in the integration of the military through Executive Order No. 9981, mandated by President Harry Truman on July 26, 1948. The executive order stated, "There shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin," forcing all branches of the military to integrate. In the long term, the airmen were able to create change within the military, opening up more command posts for African Americans. A primary example was Benjamin O. Davis Jr., who became the first black general in the U.S. Air Force, based on the airmen's success in combat. Daniel Chappie James Jr. followed suit, becoming the first four-star black general in the Air Force and later the commander of the North American Air Defense Command. These former airmen, along with a new generation of black aviators, would fight together again during the Korean and Vietnam Wars, however now, in fully integrated units. The Tuskegee Airmen not only fought for equality in the military, but upon returning home they became active participants in the civil rights movement. Inspired by their treatment in Europe's more progressive environment and frustrated by the contrast of racism at home, many veterans jumped headlong into the movement. W.E.B. Du Bois' comments on World War I are equally applicable to the black veterans of World War II. We return from fighting, we return fighting. The examples are countless. Richard H. Harris, a former member of the 99th Pursuit Squadron and esteemed friend of Martin Luther King, was a notable factor in the Montgomery bus boycott. Harris's drugstore served as a transportation hub for boycott participants. Robert L. Carter is yet another example. After serving with the Tuskegee Airmen, he became part of Thurgood Marshall's NAACP legal team, even arguing Brown versus the Board of Education before the Supreme Court. Over 50 years later, President Obama stated, "My career in public service was made possible by the path heroes like the Tuskegee Airmen trailblazed." As a result of their advocacy, the airmen not only as a group, but as individuals created lasting change in this country through the military and eventually the civil rights movement. Time and time again, the bravery and resolve of African American airmen was questioned by those who only wished to see them fail. At each of these points, the airmen stood tall and continued to disregard those who doubted them, proving themselves through their excellence in combat. They were extremely successful throughout World War II as bomber escorts, possessing one of the lowest bomber loss rates. After the war, it was their continued impact and advocacy that was an even greater success story. They challenged ideas about African Americans in all walks of life, not just in the cockpit of an airplane, bringing about great change in America and in aviation.